So, welcome everybody. And there are lots and lots of MCQ experts in our faculty. And there are lots of departments that specifically use multiple choice questions. And there are lots of people that get very irritated that multiple choice questions are the way that students are examined. So before we get going, what I want to know from you is if you've ever used multiple choice questions in your testing of students and how it felt. If you liked how they work or if they irritated you. So just a dipstick. I can have clapped hands, I can have smiley faces, you've used them, they were okay. They don't give you a thumbs down in your reactions. I suppose they give you a surprised yucky face. Okay. I got 2 thumbs. And that means that you've used them and you like them. Kath, okay, there, that's the yucky face, right? Okay. So there are really some advantages, and there are some disadvantages too in using multiple choice questions. So let's just dive straight into it, and we'll do some content, and then we'll do some chat in between. How's that? Tanya, which department are you in that you're using multiple choices quite happily?
Oh, sorry, I used multiple choices previously. I'm HSS 3 coordinator, Shira.
Oh, okay.
It's
okay.
Kat.
Oh, okay. Kat's fine. Okay, this is cool. So instead of just sharing my screen with you, oh, that's interesting. What does that look like to you? Looks like pretty small to me. Are you getting a full screen? Or are you seeing all of them? Yay, that's so cool.
Really.
Because I use the PowerPoint Live button, which I've never tried before. So that's quite cool. Yay. If I had notes, then it would show me my notes at the same time. Amazing. All right, so meaningful assessment of higher order skills using multiple choice questions, is that an oxymoron? Yes, Dina, if you do use multiple choice questions, and the question is why and what and how. So I wanted us to think about some questions. For example, is there any value to using open book multiple choice testing when students are at home, or if you set up, a test where they can open their books? Could we use multiple choice questions to test students' sense making? So in other words, to test understanding or show a performance of understanding. And then lastly, how do we write MCQs to promote assessment for learning rather than just focusing on assessment of learning, which is the end of a course perhaps rather than during the course? Okay, so Kath, you've had some experience of the open book format, and did you find that the multiple choice format actually allowed people to show their performance of understanding of the text that you were looking at, or was it just testing content?
I think the one experience I had was a very good one at the University of Pretoria 3 years ago, where I designed a multiple choice test where people sat with their texts either online or in a book format or both, and then they were guided through a sort of organic way of reading and thinking and showing their work. If they had done no preparation before, they would never have finished in time. We tested this before to check. And if they had prepared properly, they would have reached higher order questions. So we started off with very simple generic ones and built up to more complex ones. And of course, they could see correct, partially correct, and incorrect answers, and that guided them. And I felt that was a good pedagogic tool that did assess certain knowledge that the students had for sure. And it wasn't just, it was about sense making, to use your phrase, rather than merely hitting a yes or no. But that's also for the specific area I am in, and that is not the biological life sciences.
True. So that's an exciting use, and maybe we can use that example going forward a little bit to talk about how maybe we could do that in clinical type questions. So in putting down what I thought could be useful, if we're talking about lower order versus higher order, so that presupposes some conception of a taxonomy. The most commonly used one is Bloom's taxonomy. I'm not saying it's the best, but for those who haven't really had a passing acquaintance with it, we'll zoom over that. There are different types of multiple choice questions. At the moment, in some programs, we are mandated to use certain types. So I'll just go over the different types that we could possibly use. And then there's some rules. So maybe we'll talk about those rules and talk about practically how to construct those questions. Clearly, this is not the product of me, myself, and I. Millions of people in the faculty have spent many hours developing our expertise with multiple choice questions, and then people outside of the faculty too, like the international assessment expert Kees van der Vleuten, like Francois Chaliers in UCT. So a lot of people have put in a lot of time and energy and effort in talking about MCQs in the faculty. And that leads me to the point of saying that testing by multiple choice question is definitely a team sport. If you do make up questions by yourself and give them to a class by yourself and mark them by yourself, you're not utilizing the assessment method to the full. And also, you might not be doing as well as you could be if you use a tried and tested kind of method for your multiple choice questions. In our faculty, we still use Case and Swanson as the gold standard of constructing a multiple choice question. They were the ones who did the National Board of Medical Examiners, so the USMLE for the United States, and they were the forerunners of all of the testing that for undergraduate and postgraduate medical education throughout the early part of this millennium, and nothing's really replaced them yet. So this is a huge fat manual of many pages, the reference that I give you, and it's freely available on many online platforms. And in it, they give you the do's and the don'ts of how to construct a good multiple choice question. And that is part of the training that we give to people following their specific method. So what is this team sport that I'm talking about? Well, if you're going to use multiple choice questions, what you should do is figure out your blueprinting. So figure out what are the core knowledge, skills, and attitudes that you want to test. And by core, I really mean core. I don't mean the fifth detail at the end of page 462. If you're going to test by a multiple choice question, you should actually be looking at core concepts in order for students to be able to, in a way, challenge themselves against the knowledge. If you're going to use multiple choice questions, one of the ideas is that students should actually be able to learn from them. So that's part of the assessment for learning story rather than assessment of learning. You set your questions, okay? So you set your questions in relation to a student's learning opportunity, so either a lesson or an experience or something that you'd like to test. And that presupposes then that you were there or you know what was taught. Sorry, cough breaks are when the mic goes off, and then water breaks too. Not only are you catching me at the end of a long day of talking, but at the end of a really long chest invasion. So, questions should be set by people who were there, not by course coordinators who know something was taught but don't really know what was taught. And then once the questions are set, they really, really, really should be debated by peers. Sorry, struggling to get over it right now. And by vigorously debated, I don't mean slated, and I don't mean torn to shreds. But if somebody in your field, not necessarily your specialty, but in your field, reads the question and doesn't understand what you mean, or thinks you're being too specific, or feels that the language you're using is not explicit enough, then you should listen, because it's no good saying, well, that's the way in standard texts it's examined. We want our questions to be contextual. So you shouldn't be taking off a Macmillan site or the back of a Pearson textbook to construct your questions. They really have to be questions that everybody could understand just by first reading. Okay, and then you give the test. So the test is compiled, the students do the questions. That's not the end of the story. You should always have a post-test analysis of the student responses, which actually tells you quite a lot about the validity, you hope, but certainly about the reliability of the test. And remember, it's the test you're looking at, not the students. So when you talk about test reliability, it's not student reliability. And lastly, you have to make a post-test decision on basically the fairness of the questions. So yes, that does speak to validity, and also on the cut score. Anybody have an experience of cut scores and what they are? Which is an opportunity for you to put up your hand and tell me. Okay, are you scared if you put up your hand, I'll actually ask you?
No idea.
It's between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. Who wants to say anything, right?
No idea.
Okay, so the cut score
I know what it is, but I've no experience of it. Sorry, Shira.
Okay, Matty, so what is it then?
So it's there's a couple of ways of looking at it, but the most rudimentary one in my experience or in my view is the pass-fail cut score. And so
Absolutely.
you can also have a 3-level one where you have incompetent, mildly or moderately competent, and competent. So there's different kinds of cut scores that you can have. And a cut score, so we use 50%, but it's not necessarily 50%. It might be something else other than 50%. And so I know in GEMP, I think that they sometimes use 60% as a cut score.
Yeah, so the cut score is exactly that. It's above the score, people pass, and below the score, people do not pass. So it's a yet or not yet kind of point. And intuitively, for many, 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 many years, people have said 50% is the cut score in exams. In our faculty, particularly in the medical program, they use 60% as the cut score. And that's quite arbitrary. Any cut score is arbitrary. Why is knowing only 50% good enough to move on with your studies? And so, depending on the kind of test that you're looking at, a cut score could be 100%. If you're looking for 100% competence in a skill, then you would want people to get 100%. So in the Khan Academy, when they first started the video teaching, they designed a whole curriculum for maths for primary schools. And they said, you can only continue on to the next chapter if you get 10 of these examples correct consecutively. So if you can't get 10 in a row correct, then you can't move on. And so that's mastery learning, and in that the cut score is 100. So maybe that's some sort of discussion in that, are multiple choice questions supposed to be easier than practical tests? So could a cut score for a multiple choice test be higher then a test of competence of, say, a clinical skill, or should they be the same? Yeah, it is a discussion, whereas a lot of people don't see it as a discussion. And then you move on to the realm of the idea of standard setting, where the cut score is determined by the hardness of the test, which is determined by the performance of students below the 95th percentile. Given that sometimes we have genius students above the 95th percentile, and we don't want to base an easiness of a test on those kinds of students. Yeah. And also, I think what bothers our students is that if you're going to use standard setting, which is a post-test adjustment, you can only do standard setting after the test is written. And students sometimes feel that there's some shenanigans going on in that, when in actual fact it's not. It's to determine the standard of a test versus another test. So this post-test decision analysis and statistical analysis directly impacts on the kinds of multiple choice questions that you ask, and also on the kinds of feedback that students get from the test. Because if the standard set pass mark of the test is, say, 75%, it was a really easy test, right? Then any student that got, say, 54% and feels that he ought to have passed, will argue it, whereas you can say clearly that the test was an easy test and 54% isn't actually a pass in your realm. So yeah, open for quite a lot of discussion, and maybe that's something we can take up at a later date. So you can see it's not just you scratching your head and saying, what's the easiest way to ask these questions? Oh, let's do an ABCDE and think of some really weird distractors and see if the students learnt the stuff. There is a huge process involved, which also means that you can't make up multiple choice questions the night before the test. Sad though that is to acknowledge. It would be nice if we could get some movement. So let's try it there. Oh, that's interesting. So I had blocked out, yes, Matty, a whole lot of slides. Yeah, but now that I'm doing it live, it's taking it from the real presentation. So let me not dwell too much on the theory of why and wherefore, although I must admit that it's thinking about it a little bit. So you've heard the standard assessment drives learning, and students learn what they need to pass exams. True. So then that really presupposes that we structure exams so that students learn what we want them to learn. And that's one of the discussions of why we would want to use multiple choice questions to examine higher order thinking, because lower order thinking is presupposed then if they can do the higher order thinking. So if we drive them towards a superficial approach to learning, then we ask them questions where memory is really important. If we want them to start developing a deeper approach to learning, then clearly we have to give them problems that help them to think things through and then give them alternative answers to those problems, where perhaps one answer is more correct in the context that it's given than others. All right. So the reference that I used for a lot of this work is a paper by John Norcini and all of his fellows, including Vanessa Birch from UCT, who came together in 2010 at what they called the Ottawa Conference on Assessment. It was an adjunct to one of the international AME meetings. And they came out with a statement in 2011, which they published in Medical Teacher, talking about the features of good assessment. And essentially, the practical features of good assessment include that the assessment is valid, so you're assessing work that the students have learned, in other words, that it is reliable, and reliability speaks to a lot of the issues and problems that we have with assessment. So it would be that if a student took the same test at a different opportunity, they would achieve pretty much the same mark, bearing in mind they wouldn't say remember the questions, that if two people marked the test, that they would mark in the same way. So reliability speaks to those kinds of things, and you can see that with a multiple choice test, not only can you test internal reliability by using different parts of the test, but also because it's marked by a machine. So we'd hope that the reliability of the marking is quite high. Tests, good tests should have educational impact, so students should feel they've learned something from doing the test. And then also, good tests are feasible and cost effective. You can't have this amazingly complicated testing system that is just too expensive to run, because then you'd only ever do it once, and that's not really good testing. That's what the paper looks like, and the reference would be to pick up if you want on the slides. Okay, so just a word then about validity and reliability and why it would be important. Reliability does not rely on validity. So a question can be completely not valid, but it could be reliable. And that speaks to a situation like this here, where all of your questions are reliable. They're asking the same sector of work, but they're not valid for the learning that the students have done. The situation you're looking for is that questions are very valid and very reliable. Sometimes you can get questions that are valid, but they don't lie within a range of reliability. So why people like to use multiple choice questions is because depending on the number of questions, you can increase the reliability of a test enormously. That's not to say that the questions would be valid, but they'd be very reliable. Okay, I'm going to stop here and say if there's anyone who has not had some experience with Bloom's taxonomy or seen it before, won't you drop a comment in the chat or raise your hand or wave your thumb or something so that I can see if there's a group of people who have not. Because if you all have, which is pretty cool, it means we're getting places in our professional learning. If you all have, then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It was just in looking at the definition of what higher order skills might be. So to move away from the memorization and to try and get students to, yes, apply a bit, but maybe analyze and evaluate using a multiple choice question. And how we do that is by making questions more applied. But while we do that, we can't forget that what we would like is for people to remember that we want our exams to be constructively aligned. So we have to set objectives for lessons, and the pedagogy has to suit the objectives. And by that I mean if it's a practical objective, then you need to do practical learning. If it's theoretical, then perhaps you can work on the theoretical. And then the way that you assess has to be in line with the objective and the pedagogy. And we shouldn't forget that, even though we're looking at MCQs. So again, it has to be something that is important for the learning and resonates with the teaching, and that's how we assess it. So why would we use multiple choice in any circumstance, really? The first thing is that an MCQ can cover a much wider range of content than any other written response. So a short answer question certainly hones in on one topic, and an essay would involve one specific area, but a multiple choice question can ask a wide variety of areas over a short number of questions. So that's indeed seen as an advantage. The reliability of the marking is great, and also the speed of the marking is fantastic. And so that lends to those kinds of questions being prioritized because you can get the marks out so fast. And then the fact that you can use them for this application and decision-making choices. And I just highlighted the idea of constructive alignment. that the constructive alignment gives a clue to the students as to how you're going to ask the question. And if you want them to learn the 12 cranial nerves in order, and that's the question that you ask, then what you'll get is a recitation of those nerves in order, rather than asking an application question, which would need the student to work out which cranial nerve is involved. And so that's how you can use higher order questions without resorting to the recall idea. Has anybody used anything other than what's mandated in our faculty at the moment, which is A-type questions? A-type questions have multiple answer options with a single best answer. So they sometimes call them SBAs, single best answer multiple choice questions. You're just listening to my voice now. You're not responding to any questions. Anybody used anything except A-types? Yeah?
Yes, I've used mixed formats where there have been best answers and also where there have been sort of forensic efforts where a person has to dig into something and they'll be given it's sort of a timed exercise where they have to find something relevant in a set of data, but there could be several correct answers. So, for example, an archive document about the 1919 Public Health Act of South Africa, and they're asked to find references to what they understand as the use of hygiene and sanitation measures to segregate people according to race or ethnicity. And there'll be several places in that 1919 Public Health Act where they could find it and pinpoint it. So there's not one right answer.
And that is exactly the point. There's not one right answer. In fact, all the answers could be right. But there is one that is the best answer for the circumstance.
All right, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah, so those would be A-type multiple choice questions, the single best answer. For a large swathe of time, a lot of the basic sciences in our faculty used X-type questions, which are true-false statements, or with a single true or false or multiple true and falses. Why that's so good is because you can then ask 5 distinct facts, which are either true and false, and students need to know which is which. Then the third type are, they call R-type questions, which, as Anastasia notes, are extended matching questions, which I really like, because an extended matching question is not so much a question of recognition of content, but it really does involve selection. In extended matching questions, you can have 26 options where the student has to choose one. And so because of that, it's got less of the false recognition sometimes that other types of MCQs might have. And there are lots more types. I mean, for example, there are N types, which are, there are 2 correct answers, one depending on another. And lots of software that marks all of these types of MCQs. Now, one of the questions is why we would prioritize one type of question over another. So let's look at why true-false questions went out of fashion. The thing about a true or a false answer is that most of the time you're testing recall. So do they know whether this is true or false is a remembering answer. Matthew, I'll come to your comment in a minute. And also there's a good chance of guessing, because if it's either true or it's false, then they can guess. And even if you have negative marking, which you do have, it upsets the students basically when they think that they're going to be penalized for making the wrong choice. And there are all sorts of, how's this for you, human rights types, there are all sorts of papers now talking about the fact that negative marking positively advantages males, because females take less risks in examinations than males. And therefore, if they don't know the answer, they'd rather leave it out than take the guess. And yeah, so true-false questions have gone out of fashion for lots of reasons, not just because they're not probably pedagogically as sound as they could be. Matty, an interesting point about the extended matching questions. So your external felt that it was too much reading and too tricky for students whose first language is not English. I think a lot depends on how well the extended matching question is designed, because there's supposed to be a funnel with the wide part leading more and more narrow towards the one correct answer. And that would be, so in my sphere, the example would be, the following antibiotic is used to treat, I don't know, childhood meningitis. And you'd start with several in the class that it could be. And then in your next statement, so a particular child, if you're making a vignette, you would talk about specific criteria like age maybe, or renal clearance, or whatever it is. And that would then narrow down the drug choice to one or two, and then you could give one more fact which would make it apparent which one of the two it is. Only if you knew all of that decision-making information. And so theoretically, it's not supposed to be that everything is a distractor except the one correct answer, which means that students can chunk their knowledge. So if the question refers to an antibiotic, then ideally every single one of the options would be an antibiotic, but you don't have to give all 26. You could give 10, and one would be the correct answer. So while I agree that they're much more difficult, I do think that that they need to be reasonable in understanding the thought process that goes into designing an R-type MCQ. Let's look at the A types. And so they put the last point in, sure, Matty, that some A-type MCQs are just true-false MCQs converted. And I think that happened in a lot of the basic science departments for us, where overnight people had to adopt single best answers. And so they just reworked old true-false answers and made them single best answers, which you'll see doesn't work that often. But if you take an X-type answer and you want to convert it to an A-type, you could look at something like this. So this looks like a direct recall question, an X-type with 5 options and some true and some false. And if you try to turn it into an A-type, you'd have to develop what's called a vignette, a little clinical story that goes with the question. And here you're not changing the options at all. But what you're doing is you're making the question a much more thoughtful one. Instead of saying, what is it, because you need to know it off by heart, you're giving a whole case study with a lady who presents with a history and what her pulse rate is, etc., etc. And which of the following test results would support your working diagnosis? Well, it comes down to differentiating between the same things, but your vignette has turned it into an application level question rather than a recall level question, which I think is a skill that a lot of us need to learn when we're faced with having to develop questions from a set of information that we give. And so he says, clearly the secret is in the vignette. That's one of the things you can do as a team sport. You can all sit and develop vignettes for certain types of information that you're looking at. And my suspicion is that in the newer degrees where they didn't have multiple true-false questions, those X types, they would start straight away with a clinical question. Some of the disadvantages of giving clinical questions in preclinical years, like for example in the GMP 1 and 2 classes, people argue that they don't know enough to be able to answer a clinical vignette or to be able to make a decent choice. My argument would be that in the lectures that we give, a lot of them are very contextual and they are given examples. And so those examples could be put to good use when you start looking at the information that you're giving. Okay, I don't really want to go through the nuts and bolts of how you would design a good question. unless you specifically want me to go through that in terms of what a good A-type looks like. If we're assuming that to make it a higher order question, you need to have a good clinical vignette, and so that the student has got enough information to work out a good decision, be that clinical decision making or problem solving from the information that you've given. And that really is the secret. The secret is in designing a good enough question that students can answer. There are also a whole lot of do nots in setting MCQs, which I could go through for you. It's part of the case and Swanson extraction. Like, for example, a double negative. So which of the following drugs are not contraindicated? Makes people absolutely crazy. They mean, is that yes or is that no? Can I give it or can't I give it? What are you actually asking me? Or which of the following tests is not indicated in this condition? Makes it very difficult for students, and particularly students whose first language is not English. So we try and avoid those kinds of things, including the following are all true except. Because if you think it's a single best answer, then there is one true. And what you're doing there is you're making everything else false, which is not the idea of a single best answer, because it makes it incredibly easy. So one of the things that I think our students do say, is the top students particularly, that when you take a single best answer question and you make one true and 4 of them false, rather than all of them true but one more correct than any of the others, then you make it too easy. Then it's very easy to see which are the false versus which is the true. So I do think that that's something that we do need to bear in mind. Now, bear with me as I scroll through, because what I might want to spend another few minutes on before we have a discussion is just looking at the stats and what the stats can tell you. Anastasia, what happens if there are 4 distractors and 1 true, or not one of them is more true than the other? Is that what you're asking?
Apologies, Shira. What happens if there are 4 items, and so it's 3 distractors and 1 true? Because I see you have 5 answer options. What happens if there are 4 answer options? Thank you.
Yeah. So what I was talking about here was the classical single best answer with 5 answer options. But over the last 10 years, certainly, there's been a lot of literature to say that 4 options are just as statistically valid and reliable, which is interesting, because at one stage, to increase the reliability of the test, you say you need more test items, which means you either need 5 items per question or you need more questions. And as I say, over the last 10 years, certainly they've discovered that 4 items per question is just as reliable. And so it's fine if you have 4 items per question, but again, one of them must be, in the circumstance, more correct than the other 3. And that's what differentiates the, if you like, correct answer from the incorrect one. And it doesn't matter statistically at all, so you can have. And in fact, there have been quite a lot of people who've tried 3 options as well, but apparently 3 options doesn't perform quite as well as the 4 options. I think for those who are dealing with very large classes and who are looking at things like standard setting, where it matters how the students actually do, then having a very provably reliable test is a good way to defend yourself if students want to complain about the test. So that's one of the reasons why you would have to have a certain number of test items in the test to make it more reliable. Can I stop here and then just ask what direction people would like to go in? Do you want to look at the do's and don'ts of what you could or couldn't put in a multiple choice question, like what are considered the flaws, or do you want to look at the stats? Because I don't think we've got time to look at both.
I can just ask, why is it that there's only 5 answer options? Like, why not more?
So, I know from my perspective, and I mean, I'm certainly happy to take opinion on it. And Kath, I see your hand still up, so maybe you have an opinion on this too. And that is that it's really hard to find even 5 options for a good A-type vignette. You know, you sit there scratching your head and thinking, like, how am I going to get to the end of this? And so 5 was considered statistically solid in the beginning when Case and Swanson started writing. And as I said, they've dropped it back to 4 now. But I don't think people like more because it just takes them longer to set the questions. I mean, if you've got so many other options that could be viable, then maybe you want to look at an extended matching question, which is an R type. And for an R type, essentially all you need is 1 or 2 more than the answer that you're looking for. So, you know, you could have anything from 5 to 26 or even more options, depending on your software.
Cool.
Okay, so have we had a decision on whether I'm going to look at stats or whether we're going to look at what mistakes people make in setting MCQs?
I vote for what mistakes.
Okay, I have a nays vote. If your hand is still up. Okay, shall we look at mistakes? So let's look at these technical flaws that people talk about. If you want to look at the 5 rules of how to do the MCQ properly, as I just flicked through them, focus on important concepts, look at application, not recall. The STEM should actually pose a clear question. And all the distractors, so the incorrect options, should be homogeneous with the correct option. So by homogeneous, they mean if you're asking about a diagnostic test, then all the options to choose from should be diagnostic tests, not one drug, one test, one homeopathic representation, and one physiotherapy manipulation. You know, they should be diagnostic tests if that's what you're talking about. And then let's look at the technical flaws. So there are flaws that students can pick up on the better they are at writing tests. And that's why you get some students who say, I just can't write MCQs, I'm useless at them, and other students who really do well with them, even though you know that they maybe don't know the material that well. So, for example, a grammatical cue. If you say the following are diagnostic tests useful in, then you shouldn't have something that is not a diagnostic test rolling straight on. So administration via intravenous injection, like that is clearly a non sequitur when you're looking at a list. Then there are logical cues. So if you're talking about increased, decreased, or unchanged, then the 2 other options can be completely ignored because you've covered every single option. It's either increased or decreased or unchanged. What else could it be? And then there are 2 other options there. So that immediately narrows the question down to 3 options. Then use of absolute terms, such as always or never. Whenever something is never or always, it's probably incorrect because there's no such thing. You can't make that kind of generalization. Then sometimes what happens is they give one-word answers for all of the distractors, but the correct answer is this whole long fat sentence. And so if there's one long answer and all the rest are short, it's usually that one that's true. And students know that. They pick up on it straight away. And then if you get word repeats, if there is a word or a phrase in the vignette that is repeated in the answer, where the repeat is probably the correct answer. So those are all things that students just learn when they see them that makes it easier for them to handle the MCQs. Okay, so if you want to see some examples there, here we're talking about grammar cues, and it says the first step in management should be intravenous administration of. And then clearly this these are options, phenytoin or diazepam, but intravenous administration of CT scan of the head doesn't grammatically go, and intravenous administration of examination of CSF doesn't go. So already you've reduced this question down to either B, D, or E before you know anything about it. And everything that reduces the statistical number makes it easier for the student to guess. An example of the logical cues, here I said the same. Increases, decreases remains the same. There's no other option. Technical terms, never seen and never, so C and D, you can strike out straight away. So again, it's just a choice out of 3. And then the long correct answer. So C is the longest answer, and so the correct answer is C. Okay, if you look at convergence strategy, where you're repeating and repeating over and over and over again, then students can figure out how many times you've used an option. So inside 3 times, outside twice, and then anionic, cationic, unchanged, once, twice. So it's easy to see which one is the correct answer just from looking at the way you've answered the question. Okay, and then there's this idea of irrelevant difficulty. Answers that are vague. So just like always, never, anything that says rarely or usually is just too vague to be able to be true. Because how do you define usually, or how do you define rarely? And then I said again, if negatives are used in answers, you can't have a negative negative. Students get very confused over that. Okay. So why they're saying it's really important for you to do peer review is so that people can see where you're asking the same thing over and over, because you might not be able to see it. I'm going to try and skip through a little bit to all of the above and none of the above. Now, those were outlawed even before Case and Swanson, because it changes your thinking if it could be everything or nothing. In other words, more than one true, but some false. And so if they give you the option, option D is A and B above, and option C is D and E below or something, that confuses students unbelievably. And they outlawed them long before even Case and Swanson came along. Interestingly, that not the message didn't get to everyone. So, for example, in the first year chemistry exam 2 years ago, I happened to see the exam paper before it went out, and I was absolutely shocked and horrified that all of the chemistry questions involved that. A's and B's and 2 of the above and none of the above and all of the above. And that really doesn't hit with what our faculty says a good question should say. So on we go with that. And then also just consistency in your data. If you look at option C, that covers both D and E. And some of them are ranges, and some of them are specific percentages. So you shouldn't really be involved in that. Let's look at some distractor information. So distractors should be of the same type as the question is asking. And so you should be able to plot them on an axis like this. So the correct answer is the most likely given the scenario, but the distractors are less likely also given the scenario. And you could plot them like this as a justification for students. And also, there should be quite a clear gap between your correct option and your first distractor, because it definitely makes it more difficult for students if the distractors are very close together, and it's very hard to see which is the best answer out of all of them. All right, I really don't want to go into the extended matching questions and what makes a good question. We spoke about the funnel and the decision making, and I'm going to stop there because you know, we went through the do's and don'ts rather than looking at statistics, and maybe we can cover statistics another time to see what the post-test statistics can tell you about a question and whether it was as hard as you thought it was. In other words, was it as discriminatory when it comes to testing higher order thinking, and whether we should be working as teams and groups and doing regular requalification seminars for people writing multiple choice questions, because we learn from each other without a doubt. So I definitely think that it's useful in talking about something that we think that we do automatically, and also in sharing with others. So maybe for one of the technical things we could do, Yanis, is get people to send in MCQs, and we could talk about justifications of using them and how we could make them better, even in departments that use them regularly and without batting an eyelid. Thanks for listening, everybody. It really was a bit of a blast out with information, but there's really a way to, I think, make it more living for us. So yeah, maybe in one of the technical sessions later. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming along. I'm very happy to take questions if you'd like to ask. We're all still sitting here in the increasing gloom with all of our lights on. You're welcome to ask. Otherwise, we'll see you next Tuesday.